Talks to form a new German government have collapsed. Will there be new elections? The options are ugly and they're untested. Tonight, without a majority to stand behind her, Chancellor Angela Merkel is suddenly Europe's lonely leader. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
And therefore, I regret that we couldn't find a common solution.
It is exactly this common vision for the country that was missing. If the FDP had agreed to this paper, we would have had to abandon our fundamental positions. Mrs. Merkel has failed, and it is about time that she goes. We are facing a situation in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany which we never had before. We know the difficult situation our country is in now. We are not prepared to enter a grand coalition. We are not afraid of new elections.
Also coming up, Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe. He survived a military coup last week. He ignored a deadline to resign today. Next up, impeachment charges and an attack on his wife.
The main charge is that he has allowed his wife to usurp constitutional power when she has no right to run government.
We begin the day with the most powerful woman in the world, weaker than she has ever been at home. Late last night, after 4 weeks of marathon talks to form a new coalition government, Chancellor Angela Merkel was forced to admit failure. The Free Democrats, known as the FDP, walked out of the talks, saying it just isn't working. Merkel had hoped to bring the FDP and the Greens together with her Conservatives into one government, unlikely partners with the unlikeliest of chances of finding common ground. Sources close to the talks say that there were 120 points of contention still left to iron out. Well, tonight, Merkel says that she would prefer new elections over ruling with a minority government. No doubt she doesn't want to go the way of Britain's Theresa May. But new elections are risky as well. In September, Merkel came out on top again, but weaker than in any election before. Does she still possess enough political capital with the voters to win another round at the ballot box? Let's hear from the main protagonists of last night's midnight drama.
We were being forced to cast away our principles and everything that we've fought for over the years. We will not let down our voters by standing behind policies of which we're not at all convinced. It's better not to govern than to govern badly. Goodbye.
We've seen and heard a lot during these talks. There were very different styles of negotiating. In all sympathy, the Greens took some getting used to. The Free Democrats were resolute. But we believe that we were on the right path to securing an agreement.
That was the German Chancellor speaking there. For more on what we've been seeing in the last 24 hours, I'm joined by Torsten Voss. He is a professor at the Free University here in Berlin. He has written extensively on German elections, campaigns, polling, and voter behavior. Mr. Voss, it's good to have you on the day. So Merkel says she would prefer new elections instead of having to deal with ruling with a minority government. Is that where we're headed? Are we going to have new elections, do you think?
Well, if we listen to the president today, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he was quite hesitant to call new elections, and he would be in charge, or at the end of the day, he would be the one to call the new elections. So he has played the ball back to the parties. He has said, well, we have just had an election. You party leaders, you're responsible for forming a new coalition. But we have to see, we haven't seen either one of these options. Both of these options, minority government as well as the new election, would be extraordinary options for German politics. So this is really new territory that we're exploring. So we'll have to wait and see how it turns out. We really have no experience for situations things like this.
Why do you think the Chancellor, why does she prefer new elections? I mean, 2 months ago, in the last election, she came out the winner, but she had the weakest results of her political career then. Why would she want to gamble again?
Well, if you look at German political culture at the state level, but also at the federal level, we don't really have a tradition of minority governments. We actually have only had them at very, very rare instances at the state level. We have never had them at the federal level. And we're used to stability, stable governments. So what she hopes for is that with going for the option for a new election, she would get another stable coalition. This is a risky option. We're exploring risky territory. But with a minority government, she would be dependent on a party group in parliament that's not really supporting her. We have seen that she cannot count on the Liberal these days. She cannot count on the Greens these days. She cannot count on the Social Democrats these days.
Yeah.
It is. It is really new territory. So that's why she doesn't like this option. It would be new. It's not. It doesn't fit to German political culture. So we're probably headed for new elections, although the way there is really not easy to go.
Yeah, it's also unprecedented, just getting there. The fact that Merkel could not convince the FDP, a junior partner that once governed with her conservatives in a coalition government, the fact that she could not convince them to come into this coalition government, it tells us something, doesn't it? I mean, has she used up all of her political capital?
Well, these three, or actually it's four parties, they don't really go together very well. They're very different, and we have seen these long-lasting talks that haven't come to an end in the very end. And we have to keep in mind that the coalition that you're talking about, the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, they were in power from 2009 to 2013, and the end for the Liberals, of course, was that they were no longer in parliament. They were not able to pass the electoral threshold in the 2013 election. So Christian Lindner, the party leader for the Liberals, he knows that very well, and he was sort of not willing to take this risk of entering another government where he and his party lose his profile, would probably just a junior partner without being able to have successes at the end of the day. So he decided that at the end of the day it would be better for him and his party that not entering their coalition is the better option for him.
Before we run out of time, Ms. Truss, let me ask you, let's say we do have new elections, is that going to be a boom for the alternative for Germany, this far-right party?
It very much depends on the framing of what happened these days. If the frame that is dominant in the end is that the established old parties, they're just playing tricks, they're not really interested in finding solutions, that would be a classic populist argument. On the other hand, of course, the presence of the Alternative for Germany in the Bundestag, that causes the whole mess. That causes all these problems of coalition formation. So maybe voters of the Alternative for Germany last time, if there is a new election, they might reconsider. So it's really an open question in many respects, and also with respect to the fortunate future of the AfD.
Yeah, you're an optimist thinker there. I like that. Professor Thorsten Faas, we appreciate your insights tonight on the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what does the world think about this political deadlock in Europe's strongest country? Well, to take the global pulse, I'm joined tonight by Jackson James, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. And our correspondent, Barbara Vazel, joins me from our Brussels studio. To both of you, good evening. Barbara, let me start with you. In the halls of power of the European Union, Merkel's name has been synonymous with success and stability. Is her name tonight a good reason to have a stiff drink?
Oh, definitely so, Brent. I assume rather a number of vodkas and schnapps and rakis and other strong beverages will be lifted tonight just to steady European leaders' nerves. As you said, Merkel has been a rock of stability for years in the European Union. She has weathered all the crises, and she has led the European Union through many of these crises. And now the big question is, who will fill a Merkel-shaped hole in European politics? The problem also is that Europe had just begun to find its feet again. to sort of recover from the shock of Brexit. It had sort of weathered the refugee crisis. And now a new confidence had been returning. The idea was that we could next year probably have a few reforms, as Emmanuel Macron suggested, reform the Eurozone. We now have a new defense cooperation. So the signs were optimistic. And then something like this happens. It's the very last thing European leaders want. And yes, reach for another drink.
Reach for another drink. Jack, let me ask you there in Washington, how is the U.S. Capitol processing the events that we've seen here in Berlin in the past 24 hours?
Got a little bit of a deja vu here, Brent, because, you know, we had our surprise last year in November. My sense is, though, that this is not an over deal here. You remember the song, you got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. But you don't count your money until the dealing's done. The dealing's not done in Germany. And I think that to some extent we have to wait and see what happens. I'm not going to count Merkel out right now. But it strikes me that this is indicative of some of the problems that parties and party leaders are having keeping up with their own constituencies. And I think we've got that problem on both sides of the Atlantic.
And Barbara, if there are new elections, we're talking about uncertainty lasting maybe through February, March, maybe even into April. What does this mean for Brexit negotiations?
Suppose probably not that much, because the EU 27 is quite united with regard to Brexit. They do have their line and they're supposed to stick to it. And even a caretaker, Angela Merkel, can still do some steering. She does have a lot of personal connections to all European leaders. She can talk to them behind the scenes and they can sort of iron out difficulties. And also, you have to consider Emmanuel Macron, to a certain degree, can sort of take things up, because in Brexit talks, every veto is a veto. So if he says no to a certain type of deal or to a certain type of development, things cannot move on. So he can, to a certain extent, take her place. And probably Brexit talks will just sort of drag on as they used to do during the last weeks.
All right, so Monsieur Macron can maybe take up the slack here for a while. Jack, what about U.S. President Donald Trump? I mean, he has attacked Merkel in the past. One could assume that today's news must have been music to his ears.
I'm not sure he's paying a whole lot of attention to that right now, Brent. I mean, I sense that basically the Merkel was set up in some ways here by the Trump administration as a person they wanted to criticize for many things. But remember, all politics is local. And I think that to some extent what's going on here is that the depiction of Merkel as the leader in the Western world, given the Trump election, was something that grated on President Trump. We'll have to see and wait and see how this whole development begins to evolve. But again, I want to point out, I'm not entirely sure we should count Merkel out right now. Europe is in need of leadership. She has provided it for the last 12 years. It seems to me that it's in need of a Franco-German partnership right now. Macron is sitting there waiting for the phone to ring. I think it's important that we wait and see how things unfold before we reach conclusions about the end of the Merkel era.
Okay, so you don't want to count her out just yet. And Barbara, again, let's go back to Macron and this notion that this could be a chance for France to have a rebirth as leader of Europe. Am I taking it too far, or do you think that that could be precisely what's going on here?
I think you're taking it too far, Brent, because France, of course, is trying to regain its role in the European Union, which it absolutely didn't fill out during the last years of the government Hollande. However, Emmanuel Macron is a very young leader, even though very ambitious. He's quick out of the starting blocks, but he doesn't have the experience that Angela Merkel has. Nobody can talk to Vladimir Putin like she can, for instance, or can you imagine Emmanuel Macron sort of figuring out how to solve the Ukraine crisis? I mean, she really does have the most experience of all European leaders. And so it's a tandem. It's Paris and Berlin together that are needed in Europe. Alone, he will be really very much alone at home, Emmanuel Macron, and he can't step into her shoes. However, I think Jackson is right. It's much too early to write her off, even though the European Union is nervous tonight, and everybody's thinking thinks this is something that we did not want, we did not need, and they're hoping, still hoping, for a good outcome.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree this is something that we did not need, that is for sure. All right, Barbara Vazel in Brussels and Jackson Janes in Washington. To both of you, thank you for being on the day. We appreciate it.